Greetings, everyone. My name is Natalie Evans Harris, and I'm Executive Director of the Black Wealth Data Center. We're excited today to have a conversation with Noah Urban, the Executive Director of Data Driven Detroit, about what it's like to drive change at the local level. BWDC, for those that haven't come across us, was launched in September 2022. And since then, we have played an important role in sharing the importance of using data to drive change, to understand the experience at the national, state, down to the local level, down to the zip code level, around what wealth equity looks like and what it doesn't. We're excited to have this conversation and talk about the real world experiences for Data Driven Detroit. If you have any questions, please make sure to include them in the chat and follow along in the chat for any guidance around ways to participate and interact in the conversation, including a poll we are getting ready to post so we learn a little bit more about our audience and can keep up with your questions. Noah, so excited to have you here and excited for you to share more about yourself. For today's webinar, it's the second half of a two-part series we started in January with Lamar Gardier of the Data Center out of New Orleans. Both the Data Center and Data Driven Detroit are recipients of grants the Black Wealth Data Center awarded recently with the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership. These grants support projects at the local level that increase the use of wealth-related data, build the data capacity of local organizations working to increase Black wealth, and inform solutions to increase racial wealth equity. We're thrilled to have Noah here for round 2 of this series. And Noah, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me today. Let's establish a let's establish a baseline understanding. What does Data Driven Detroit do and why? What are you trying to solve for?
Yeah, so Data Driven Detroit, we've been around for about 15 years now, and we were established to be Metro Detroit's community data hub. And what we mean by that is we play the role of being an intermediary between all of the mess of information that's out there in the world and a lot of the organizations in Detroit who can use that information to do good. Especially because larger corporations, sometimes municipal governments, depending on where you're from, they have access to a lot of data and a lot of information, but smaller and medium-sized nonprofits and community members really don't necessarily have that same luxury. So that's really what our role is. We exist to kind of go out into that mess of data, make it more easy for people to digest and understand so that they can use it for action, especially if they don't necessarily have access to a data analyst or a team of analysts on their own.
And how much, just as a follow-up question, because being new into the space, we're often balancing the getting the data to a presentable part and then supporting our users in turning it into something actionable. Tell us a little bit about how much time you're spending creating that data and how much time you're spending turning it into an actionable resource.
Yeah, so the way we actually work, and it's a quirk of our structure, we're actually not even a nonprofit. We're organized as a low profit limited liability company. And so, or an L3C, a social enterprise. So basically, we work very much like a consulting firm, but with a public purpose. And so all of our funding comes from project-based work, project-based grants. So there's a lot of work that goes, like us going out and cleaning it, but almost every project that we take on has to have some sort of public-facing component to it. So it's actually a fairly even split between getting the data and making something cool, useful, actionable out of it. Some projects are more on the gathering side, some are more on the design and creation side, but it's a pretty even split across those things.
And tell us a little bit about yourself as a co-executive director. Where are you
Yeah.
coming from as you approach this work?
Yeah, so I have a background in urban planning, and that has given me kind of a keen awareness of the power that data can have to help, but also the power that data can have to harm.
Mhm.
There's a lot of history in the urban planning field of data being used to marginalize or exclude populations. Redlining is the biggest example, but there's plenty of others out there. And so I tend to be really curious about data, but and like what it can tell us about the world that we live in, because I think that's really fascinating. But I also tend to be really skeptical of it at times as well. And so I'll often be asking questions about like, well, how good is this information? Like, what's the source? What can you actually reasonably say? Because a lot of times numbers can be presented with, they can be presented with a lot of authority, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the methodology to get that number to the point where it was reasonable or sound. And so I'm wanting to make sure like that people are like when people are looking at data, it's they're interrogating it, they're thinking critically and curiously about it, but also that they're seeing the people behind that information too, because that's something that numbers can very easily mask as well.
Absolutely. Given your urban planning background, do you have maybe 1 to 2 questions that you always ask when you're presented with data?
So the first part one is kind of what is the person behind this information trying to achieve?
Hmm.
Which is doesn't have to be a bad thing. I mean, we're all people, and but everybody, nobody is unbiased. Like everybody has some kind of agenda when they're presenting a number. So what's the reason that they're trying to publish this into the
What are
world?
the intentions? Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, what are the intentions here? Who's behind this? What is this? And then that kind of helps you situate the number in its proper context.
Hmm.
And then I also really look at like I try to dive in and understand like what's the data source and what is this person trying to say with that data source? Are they trying to say, hey, you know, Detroit's population is X, and then I look at their data source and that's using the 2010 census. That's you know, there's not a lot necessarily that should be done with that data, and so it's like understanding the source and understanding the intentions. I think are really important to using it effectively.
Amazing. And it's Open Data Week this week, and I know that a lot of the data that you use, as well as the center, is open data for us primarily at the federal level, but we are working our way down to the local level. It's only natural that we have to talk a little bit about what does Open Data Week mean for Data Driven Detroit? To what extent do you have access to open data in Detroit and Michigan? To what extent are you creating it, giving some of your relationships? And how would having more access to that data advance your work?
Yeah, so we're in a fortunate place in Detroit at the local level. We've had an open data executive order active in the city since 2015, which established the city's open data initiative and their efforts. And so we have access to an open data portal that provides a lot of pretty good and detailed information about the city itself. Now, I mean, it's city data, it's municipal data, it's messy, but it exists. And that's a lot better than you can say for a lot of cities across the country. Um, so that is really lucky. It's a bit more challenging for us when we get to the county and state levels. And so there, it's a mix of capacity and I think just kind of sometimes entrenched bureaucracy, where the data is behind more relationships, like individual relationships, where people kind of control the information. Sometimes there's a cost to access it. And so that's really large. But for Detroit itself, we're really fortunate. I think probably the biggest challenge we actually have right now is there's a huge community interest around like businesses and business ownership and things like that. Especially Detroit is an 80% Black African American city, and so like minority-owned businesses, like how much of the economic activity in Detroit is actually going to Detroiters. But there's the state of Michigan doesn't really release the business database that they have in a
Mm.
public open fashion. So there's a lot that could be answered through that isn't. So I think that's the biggest gap that we're seeing.
That's a great example of how having more data and more of certain types of data could advance your work. Do you have any other examples?
Oh boy, so many. I think the other thing that we're really trying to get into a bit more is closer to real-time information too. So the
Mm.
city data portal makes this really possible because a lot of the data sets that are on there update on like a weekly or even daily basis. Um, but it's always challenging trying, like when you're helping an organization trying to understand like what their neighborhood is like right now, to tell them, okay, here's a data point that's a 5-year average of what your neighborhood looked like 2 years ago. So like what you would normally get from most data that the census provides. And so what we're really trying to focus on now is how can we bridge that gap using some of those more administrative data sources to get, especially a lot of like the on the ground organizations who need like the close to real time data, how can we get them closer to that?
Interesting. And so I think we want to take a quick break and see how the audience is feeling about the conversation, if they have any questions or any responses from the poll. So I'm just looking over really quick. So how about we take a break and ask the question, which categories best describe your role? Oh, it looks like we have a lot of community engagement and direct services folks in the audience, as well as researchers. So talking about the areas where we could use more gaps, I'm certain are areas that we could use more support from those communities. Once again, it's how we use the data that drives actions. Thank you so much. So let's pivot a little bit. I think a lot about democratizing and humanizing data. And Data Driven Detroit always seems to follow that similar theme. You feature a community activist in a video on your website, and you talk about the importance of remembering that behind every data point is a living, breathing person. You've said that several times during this chat already. How do you make sure that people are centered and communities are centered in your work?
Yeah, it took us a while to get to this point, and I want to call that out because it was very much a journey for us to get to this place of where we are really centering like people and users at the core of everything that we do. When we first started off, we thought like, hey, let's just throw spreadsheets out into the world and we'll solve everyone's open data problems in Detroit. And yeah, you know that wouldn't that
I'm
does
sure
not.
that went well.
Yes, it went perfect. And so, but then we started from there to experiment with like ever more sophisticated methods of visualizing data. You know, starting off with like charts and tables, then maps, online tools, things like that. And because the tools were really fantastic, we had all these wonderful interactive data tools. But because so many of them were created for a specific project, to answer someone's specific question, once they would be released, they'd make a big splash, and you would never really see anybody maintain them or pick them up or keep using them. And what really started to change this for us was in 2015, we got some funding from Microsoft to launch a civic user testing group in Detroit, which was basically a network. We recruited a bunch of Detroit residents, gave them $5 gift cards just for signing up to be in this network. And then we would conduct user tests of data tools and technologies and things that we were doing at D3 or that the city was building. And residents would have a chance to participate in those tests and get a $20 gift card for doing that. So that really was a big shift for us in being able to center residents at the core of what we're doing. And then we really started building out more intensive user design and user developed processes since then. And I mean, now looking back on all of that time, it makes perfect sense. Like data's always about people. Like someone always did something to create a data point, whether that's filling out a survey, boarding a bus or a train, making a phone call that's leading someone to come out and like look at this overgrown vacant lot next to their house or something. Like there's always people behind this, and so it's like, of course, it makes sense that we would want to have people ground truthing our data, contributing to the development processes and everything like that. It just, yeah, it took us a while to get there, but we're really happy now that we are.
Oh, and it's so hard to make sure you have enough engagement and enough diversity of engagement so that you're not, exacerbating a bias in the decisions that you make. I think you and I both agree that the power of data is in getting it into the hands of the people that can drive action, the very folks that we're seeing on in this conversation today. Can you tell us a little bit about some ways that you do engage with your target audiences, with the people that you want to see using the data, such as community activists, community-based organizations?
Mhm. Yeah, so we do a lot of, we try to engage people throughout the entire design process of a project. So at the very beginning, we do our best to identify who are kind of like the main stakeholders, especially if it's going to be like a larger publicly facing data tool, like who are the main stakeholders in this process. And then from the very beginning, we will start to ask some questions like, okay, what data is the most important to you? What are the ways you need to see this? It's like very basic questions, but that allows us to, instead of just making assumptions from our very deep in the weeds perspective, it allows us to zoom back out and understand like, okay, here's what the community actually needs. Then we will design a whole bunch, do a very iterative design process, lots of sketches, wireframes. I think we're always going to have a graphic designer on staff now. For a while we didn't, but now there's always going to be one. Um, and like, but really like showing people like visual things and helping, like getting their feedback to help refine those designs. Like, does this thing work for you? Does this answer the questions in the way that you would expect to see it answered? Um, and that's really how we'll start. We also do our best to do this, like to not just like once we release a tool or a project or something, not to just like sit on our laurels, but to keep engaging people, to have kind of an ongoing community advisory group or committee that will help
Mhm.
to just provide occasional feedback because people's needs change over time. And so we do our best. We have our main tool right now, the State of the Detroit Child, has an advisory committee. They just meet a couple times a year. We review what's working with the tool for them, what's not working, and that just helps us adjust and pivot directions as needed.
Sounds like you could draft a couple of blogs on best practices for keeping people engaged with data, which is not an easy thing. I don't think
Oh,
everybody's as fascinated about it as I am. Not everybody loves
yeah.
it as much as I do.
Challenging, yes.
So, Data Driven Detroit recently received a grant from the Black Wealth Data Center and National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership to help bridge home financing gaps in Detroit and increase Black wealth through home ownership. How will you use data to accomplish these goals? And what
Yeah,
challenges do you anticipate in achieving the goals of your work?
yes. So this has been a really big challenge for Detroit for a very long time. To provide a quick bit of context, our housing market has for a very long time been challenged, to put it mildly. So the residential mortgage market basically cratered even before the recession in 2008. Like we had a massive number of foreclosures in from like 2005 to 2008, and housing values have never really recovered. So what's they've started to slowly improve, but they're still well below what you would expect to pay in most other cities, most other metro areas. And so what that's created is this missing middle area where there's a lot of homes that aren't necessarily mortgageable, but the sale price on them is too high for somebody to buy with cash. And
Mm,
so it's like this weird, messy area, and it's a real challenge for Detroiters because if a home is retailing at like $40,000, that could be life changing for someone, especially someone on the lower end of the income spectrum. But they can't get a mortgage to finance the home, and they don't have the cash to be able to buy it. So what we're really hoping to do is use some data that we've been able to acquire from our county around using property transactions and use that data to identify one, where are these neighborhoods in Detroit? Because there's not a lot of good understanding of where that is. What are some of the characteristics of those groups in, or what of the neighborhoods where those properties are located? Like, are there some commonalities around them? And then we're also working with a partner organization, Detroit Future City, to conduct some focus groups as well of people who have tried to buy homes in some of these neighborhoods to
mm.
understand what some of their barriers were. So using kind of a mixed methods like qualitative and quantitative approach to get a better handle on what this problem is, and then hopefully start convening tables to come up with like, okay, here's like the bigger scope of the issue. Here are some of the solutions that you can be. Here's where the greatest need is, and start maybe bridging some of those gaps.
What I love about that is it's really centered around not just getting the data that you need. So often when we're talking about applications and solutions, it becomes about, okay, do we need public data? Do we need private data? Do we have all the data
Mhm.
that we need? What you're talking about is how do you bring people along
Yes.
in the development of the solution? And that's amazing.
Hmm.
Um, And yet another example of how you make sure that your data stays focused on the people.
Yes.
Before we open up the floor to questions from our audience, is there anything else you want to share?
Yeah, so I wanted to give actually just a quick shout out and credit. I know you mentioned National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership or NNIP at the start of the call, but just give them, this is the network of organizations that basically do what D3 does, for those who aren't familiar with them. And a lot of the work that we do at D3 either wouldn't be possible without NNIP or wouldn't be nearly as effective without NNIP. So other partners across the country have helped us inform our own user design processes and everything. They've helped inspire our own housing and property data systems that are probably, I think, the most actionable bit of data that we've been able to collect, and what's fueling this work with the Blackwell Data Center that we're working on. And it's also, I mean, just a great resource for anybody to learn about neighborhood level data work that's happening in your city. So check them out if you would like to. Folks on the call, and if your city doesn't have a partner yet, see what groups are doing this kind of work in your community and encourage them to get in touch. Yeah.
+1 to that shout out. Even before taking on this role as executive director for the Black Wealth Data Center, I have been a huge fan of NNIP and the work that they've done to just improve the standards for how we collect data and talk about people in our work. So definitely +1 to that. And that actually ties to the first question that I am seeing in the chat. And it is from, and I apologize if I don't get your name correctly, A. Jamal Bindon. And he's asking, how can organizations better find data institutions that ethically represent Black and Brown populations? And how would one gauge ethics in data related to race? So, of course, I'll have you answer the question, but I think you kind of started to answer the question talking about NNIP, because NNIP, in addition to being a great resource and support for local data centers such as Data Driven Detroit, also publish in their partnership and relationship with Urban Institute several guides on how to use data responsibly and how to do race disaggregated data responsibly, and how to consider ethics when you're using data to talk about people in communities. So I would say check out some of their resources and look to organizations like them to point you in the right direction for where to find other department or other centers that collect data in an ethical and responsible fashion. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I think the only thing I would add to that around NNIP is that actually the partners do go through a fairly rigorous vetting process to become a member of the network. And so that's why there's only 30 of us or so, give or take. But all of us essentially sign on to the same pledge that, like, one, we're focusing on neighborhood level data, and two, we're doing it with the intention of using that information to help organizations that aren't traditionally represented in conversations where resources, are allocated. And so there's already this like equity focus and framework built into NNIP and a lot of the work that's happening. And so it's a really great place to start in terms of understanding organizations that better do data equity work.
And I would challenge, even if you're not certain of an organization and how they're doing their data collection, whether they're being responsible, question it. Because the
Mm-hmm.
more we question it, the more the standards will be adopted and the more that will raise the level of practice across all of the centers. So I think we have time for one more question. Well, I'm going to try to fit in two. Tied along to this, I'd love to hear from you. How do you ensure data is used ethically and does not perpetuate disparities?
Yes. So there's a lot of things that we try to do, and we're definitely still on a learning journey with this. And we're doing as much as we can do it within our control. So I think the first thing that we've really started doing is focusing much more on an asset-based framing with the data that we share out rather than a deficit-based framing. Because from the beginning, that helps us to shift the conversation, especially in a city like Detroit, where so much of the conversation is traditionally around the deficits that the city has. Like we're really trying to shift it more from being like, oh yeah, there's X number of people living below the poverty level to, hey, X number of people live above the poverty level, and like just, and I think that helps ensure at least some of it from the beginning piece of it. I think the other component is that we really try to make sure, again, that the community is involved in all elements of our work and really helps to guide and inform things. So we have a project right now where we are working on collecting and presenting a lot of neighborhood level data in an index format. So, rolling a bunch of indicators up to summary scores. And one of the things that we heard from a lot of the organizations that we were working with who have been advising us on this is that if they, if say a speculator or like a private speculator who comes in and is able to see those scores, that can make it really easy for them to just like write off a neighborhood for investment or do some unfortunate things with the data. And so we decided based on that to put that information behind the login and the eventual data tool that we'll be building. And so we'll be able to control more access to it. Login will be free, but people will have to at least tell us what they want to use the data for and why they want to use it. So that way we can, kind of control some of the access. And I think, we're an open data organization. If we hadn't had that community input, we might have just gone ahead and released the data without that because, it's numbers of data that can be helpful. But getting that input on like when it's helpful to have the more detailed level of information versus when it's not for community organizations helps us kind of ensure that like have an additional safeguard.
That's a really great point. And actually, we similarly have had those conversations. We have a new release coming out, and we recently just put in place user profiles for that very reason. If we're going to allow folks to be able to download the data, we want to understand what you want to do with it, especially if you're going to attach our name to it. We want to make sure that you, as users, are using it the way that it was intended. I want to thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you, audience, for the questions and for participating in the poll. If you haven't checked out blackwealthdata.org, please do. You can click in the top right corner and be able to preview creating profiles before we do our big launch next week. You'll also see on the screen different ways to connect with the center. We not only are a resource for getting access to data, but we're always looking for partnerships and ways to collaborate with the community. Because as Noah has said, and hopefully you've heard from me, data in action and getting it into the hands of you are what matters most to us. Thank you for your time. Please visit our site and also check out the work of Data Driven Detroit. They're doing some amazing things that we hope translate to other local areas. And I hope you've learned as much as I have. Thank you so much and good day.